ADOS is everywhere. Cut the check.
So we're going to go over a couple of bills and acts that he had a hand in just to get a glimpse of, I like to call him Lock 'em Up Joe. And it's going to take a look at a few of the things that he felt would be best to make law. Hold on for me, and we're going to get right into it. So the first bill we're going to look at, we're going to go back to 1984 when he worked with Republican Senator Strom Thurmond in the Reagan administration to craft and pass the Comprehensive Control Act, which enhanced and expanded civil asset forfeiture and also entitled local police departments to a share of captured asset. And some of the negative effects of the 1984 Crime Control Act, it actually led to a 32% rise in federal prisoners over the next 2 years between 1984 to 1986. There was also a doubling of residential and commercial property that was seized. There was a sharp drop also in witnesses being granted protection. And for the numbers, we have real property seizures from 1984 to 1985 doubled from 130 to 260. So it just created an incentive to lock more people up. It created incentives for property grabs when you've seen the rise of a lot of homes being put up for sale that were seized, that were owned by people that were involved in the drug business, cars, boats, all kinds of property. If you can remember back in the late 80s where you could actually buy some of these properties in auction. So there was a huge financial incentive to tie people into drug conspiracies and things of that nature. Again, so that was 1984 with the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. Moving on to 1986, Joe Biden co-sponsored the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created new mandatory minimum sentences for drugs, including the infamous crack versus cocaine sentencing disparity. And basically what that was about was, at that time, what it created was the minimum 5-year federal prison sentence if you distributed a minimum of 5 grams of crack cocaine, as opposed to powder cocaine where you could distribute up to 500 grams and receive the same 5-year federal prison term. So that was one of the highlights of the bill, and also one of the most detrimental aspects of the bill. And just to give you an idea of the effect of that bill, in 1986, before the enactment of federal mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine offenses, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 11% higher than whites. 4 years later, the average federal drug sentence for African Americans was 49% higher. So we can actually see how that exacerbated the already glaring disparity in sentences between African Americans and white Americans for the same crimes. And one of the crazy things about it is that when they were actually selling or, trying to win people over with these laws, they actually made a lot of promises to go after serious and major drug traffickers, but the exact opposite proved to be true. And to give that a little context, we can look at the stats which stated in 2003, whites constituted 7.8%, African Americans constituted more than 80% of the defendants sentenced under the harsh federal crack cocaine laws. And this was despite the fact that more than 66% of crack cocaine users in the United States are white or Hispanic. And not to be left out of the equation were African American women, where their incarceration rates from 1986 to 2006 increased by 800%. And this was largely driven by drug convictions. And this was compared to an increase of 400% for women of all races for that same time period between 1986 to 2006. Another stat for good measure, in the year 2000, there were approximately 790,000 African American men in prisons and jails. That same year, there were around 603,000 African American men that was enrolled in higher education of some sort. And in the 80s, this was a time when crack cocaine was rampant. Drugs and crime was a major theme in the inner city, especially densely populated urban areas. Also, it seems to be that was the major focus of much of the media or propaganda that was used to promote these harsh drug penalties in bearing the numbers, knowing that whites and Hispanics use crack at a much higher rate. They were never painted as being drug demons or in need of being policed or saved from the scourge of crack in the 80s. A lot of it was just fear-based marketing, and it was targeted to the black community. And in the midst of all of this, we had a very vocal Joe Biden, and at that time the Democrats were definitely trying to move to the right of the Republicans so that they could be able to say that they were tough on crime, whereas before they had always been labeled soft on crime. And the name Michael Dukakis comes to mind, those who remember the Willie Horton tactics that were employed by the Reagan campaign. So here we had Joe Biden doing his best to be tougher than the Republicans on crime. And his rhetoric, oh my God, was very egregious. I'm going to actually play a little bit of his speech on the Senate floor, in which this was leading up to the 1994 crime bill, which we're going to discuss now. The 1994 crime bill that was eventually signed into law by President Bill Clinton.
Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth. I'm the guy that said, rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it. And even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. It's a shame, but we don't know how to rehabilitate. But there is a consensus, and I will cease. A, we must make the streets safer. I don't care why someone is a malefactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society, try to help them, try to change their behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. But we would be absolutely stupid as a society if we didn't recognize the condition that nurtured those folks still exist. And we must deal with that.
So let's talk about the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, better known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. Written by Biden, signed by Clinton, this bill increased funds for police and prisons, fueling a huge expansion of the federal prison population. It also contributed to the rapid growth of militarized police forces. They used new federal funds to purchase hundreds of thousands of pieces of military equipment. And we kind of can see the fruit that is being born today in many of the riot. Even before these riots, we see police, local police, with all kinds of military equipment and tanks. We saw that in Ferguson. They have grenade launchers, rocket launchers. They have everything that the military has. And again, that was as a result of the 1994 crime bill that Joe Biden always enthusiastically takes credit for. I don't know why, but he's very proud of having had a hand in passing that legislation. So again, the 1994 federal crime bill created tough new criminal sentences, and it incentivized states to build more prisons and to pass truth in sentencing laws. And this is something that Joe Biden usually tries to use to say that the 94 crime bill didn't increase federal prison population. What they did was they offered grants for new prisons to states who imposed truth in sentencing policy, in turn imposing mandatory minimums for time served. So basically, he wanted states to mirror the federal system, in which the federal system required you to do 85% of your time. So he said to the states, hey, if you make prisoners stay in prison longer, we'll give you more money for prisons. So again, in turn, the crime bill initially required states to pass laws mandating that violent offenders serve at least 85% of their sentences before the states could receive truth in sentencing grant funds. There was a study that found that 16 states at their time changed their truth in sentencing laws following the 94 crime bill, and that qualified them for federal funding. By 1994, all states had passed at least one mandatory minimum law, but the 1994 crime bill encouraged even more punitive laws and harsher practices on the ground, including by prosecutors and police to lock up more people and for longer periods of time. The 94 crime bill provided funding for 100,000 new police officers and $14 billion in grants for community-oriented policing. It also included a federal three-strike provision which mandated life in prison for certain felony convictions and expanded the death penalty to include 60 additional crimes. And I remember one guy, his third strike, I believe he got locked up for stealing a loaf of bread. You know, he'd been a petty criminal all his life, you know, burglary, stuff like that, shoplifting, and the guy ended up stealing a loaf of bread or something of that nature, and being that was his third strike, he got life in prison. Ridiculous. So yeah, and on a personal note, you know, 1992 was my first time voting. I voted for Bill Clinton enthusiastically, as was the tradition in my household growing up. We were Democrats, so of course I voted blue all the way down the ballot, and this was 92. Didn't realize that I would get caught up in the aftermath of the 1994 crime bill myself, and that might be something I get into a little bit later, but I have personal experience, again, being that at that time, 94, 95, the overall mood as far as criminal justice, there was no more rehabilitation. Many state prisons were changing their names from Department of Corrections to Department of Prisons, just to kind of give you that overall message that, look, you come in here to get locked up. It's not about rehabilitation, and you heard Joe Biden say as much. We're not worried about you getting better. We just worried about you serving this time. So with the mood being more time, less parole, I got caught up in the first offense, received a conviction, a felony conviction, and whereby I was actually eligible according to the guidelines. I was eligible for parole in approximately 20 months of a 5-year term. I was actually required to do and serve my whole 5-year term, not realizing that I had actually voted for Bill Clinton, who actually signed the bill that was written by Biden. And I know I'm not the only one. This was the law that led to, 1 in 3 black men at some point in time being on either parole, probation, or actually in prison. Ridiculous. So now they want to prop them up in 2020 and think that, well, they probably know black men won't be voting for Biden. They definitely going after black women, but I just want black women who support black men to know. And many of y'all have had this affect you personally, be it a brother, a son, nephew, a cousin, your husband, father, may have had these laws impact their lives and in turn impact your lives. So Joe Biden has already had a chance, and we pretty much see what he's about. We cannot let him get another chance, especially with him selecting Kamala Harris as his running mate. She was his counterpart in the law enforcement, and she helped to enforce the 1994 crime bill that he championed so fiercely. And her record as DA in San Francisco bears that out. That's for another video. But just wanted to touch you and highlight some of Joe Biden's criminal justice record, the legislation that he has championed that has been detrimental to the black community, particularly the American descendants of slavery, although this affected all black people. So thanks for listening. I'll be back again with another video. If you haven't already, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you can be notified when I drop new content. Again, this is Bill Money, Dirty Laundry Media, signing out.